By the Tuesday after the storm, every farm in Colter County had the same thing piled up in the yard. Broken trees. Twisted. Split. Good for nothing but a landfill run, as far as most people were concerned, which is what made it so strange that Milo Strand was driving from farm to farm, asking to take them, for free no less, while half the county laughed at him for the trouble. He showed up at the Cutter place Wednesday morning, pulling an empty flatbed trailer, and he didn't offer Denny a dime for the maple that had come down across the fence line, split at the base, half its crown driven into the mud. He just asked if he could take it. "Take the whole pile," Denny told him, laughing. "I was going to pay somebody to haul that mess off anyway." By Friday, Milo had been to 6 farms. He wasn't buying storm debris. He was hauling it away for free and coming back for more. Word travels fast in a county that size, and not all of it was kind. Some men figured he was saving everybody a landfill fee and didn't think twice about it. Others weren't so sure a man drives from farm to farm for 3 days straight, chainsaw rattling around in the truck bed, unless he's after something. Nobody had heard him explain himself. He'd just look a fallen tree over, cut what he wanted, leave the rest stacked at the fence line, and drive off toward the old Strand place, where a pile behind his barn kept climbing higher every day. "Planning on building a house out of that?" Ray Holt asked him outside the feed store, half joking, nodding toward the load riding low on Milo's trailer. Milo just said he had room for it. "You're hauling other people's garbage, is what you're doing," Ray's brother added, not quite as kindly. Milo didn't argue. He also didn't stop. The strange part was that Milo wasn't taking the biggest trees, or even the straightest ones. Plenty of what people offered him, he'd look over once and leave, sitting exactly where it fell. By the second week, the piles behind his barn had grown into something people slowed their trucks down to look at from the road. Broken maple, split oak, a few walnut logs with the bark peeled clean off one side where the wind had scoured it raw. None of it looked like anything worth the diesel it cost to haul. Torn root balls the size of trucks sat tipped on their sides at 3 different farms because nobody had the equipment to deal with them yet, and every gravel road in the county had a ditch full of debris waiting on a county crew that wasn't coming for weeks. 2 different tree services had already been through, quoting farmers $200 and $300 a load just to haul the wreckage to the county burn pile, and most men were happy to sign whatever the quote was, rather than look at a broken tree line one more day. And that was exactly what nobody could figure out about Milo. If he wanted firewood, he already had more than he'd burn in 10 winters. He wasn't cutting any of it for the wood stove. He was sorting it, walking a fallen trunk end to end, running a hand along the split wood, sometimes cutting a thin wedge right there in the mud, just to look at what was underneath the bark before deciding whether it came home with him at all. And that sorting is really where this story starts. Here's what nobody in the county knew about Milo Strand. He'd spent his boyhood summers in his grandfather's workshop, not because he loved farming, but because farming was what was left after the workshop closed. His grandfather, Ansel Strand, had built fiddles, not for a living exactly. Ansel farmed too. But there'd been a real trade in it once. 3 or 4 instruments a year, sold to musicians as far off as Nashville. Ansel never bought his wood from a supplier. He walked fence rows and windbreaks after every bad storm because he swore there was something inside certain broken trees that a sawmill would never think to look for. He never fully explained it, not even to Milo. He'd just run a hand along a split trunk and say some trees earned something in all that wind that a calm, sheltered life never gave them. Milo hadn't touched a chisel in 20 years by the time the derecho hit. The workshop had been sold off piece by piece after Ansel died, when Milo's father decided there was no future in fiddles and better money in row crops. But some things don't leave a person. Milo still knew how to read a broken log the way his grandfather had taught him, not by what a tree looked like, standing, but by how it had failed. That's what he was doing at every farm he visited. He wasn't after size, and he walked past plenty of big, straight-grown trees without a second look. What he wanted were the twisted ones, trunks that had spent decades fighting a crosswind before the storm finally finished them off. He'd check where a trunk had snapped, look at how tight the growth rings ran near the break, run a thumbnail across the grain to feel for a ripple under the surface, and more than once he'd get down on his knees in the mud, with a hatchet just to expose a few inches of clean wood. Before he'd say yes or no, diameter mattered less to him than most people assumed. He'd pass over a wide, straight trunk two men could barely wrap their arms around, and instead load a smaller, gnarled section that looked, to anyone watching from the road, like the ugliest piece on the whole property. Most of the time, what he found underneath was ordinary. But every so often, under the torn bark, there'd be a shimmer in the grain that made him load the whole section onto the trailer, without a word to anybody watching. The first small proof came 3 weeks in. A furniture maker 2 counties over, a man Milo had done occasional work for, took one of the maple sections off his hands, paid him more for that single busted-up storm log than most of Colter County would have believed a load of firewood was worth. Milo didn't tell anyone. He just kept driving from farm to farm and kept filling the barn. By the second month, the project had stopped looking clever and started looking like a problem. The barn was full. The good stuff had to be stacked outside now under tarps, and a wet October meant some of it was starting to check and crack before Milo could get it milled. His mill, an old resaw he'd bought used and half rebuilt himself over a couple of winters, broke a blade on a piece of oak with a fence staple buried in it, and sat useless for 11 days waiting on a part that had to come from out of state. His wife, Carol, kept the household books, and she was the one who first said out loud what the fuel receipts were starting to show. His son, Wyatt, home for harvest, wasn't shy about saying the rest. "You've got a barn full of broken trees and no buyer for most of it," Wyatt told him one night, standing in the doorway looking at the stacks by lantern light. "I get the maple thing, Dad, I do. But you've hauled home walnut, oak, ash, stuff that's just rot waiting to happen." He wasn't wrong. Milo had taken more than he could sort in the early weeks before he'd tightened up what he was willing to bring home. Maybe a third of that first haul turned out to be exactly what everybody assumed all of it was: waste. Cracked past saving, or rotted soft at the core where rainwater had worked its way in through the break. He'd burned fuel and time and trailer tires, hauling home garbage right alongside the good material. And for a stretch in October, with the mill down and the tarps leaking, and a second furniture buyer turning down a batch as nothing special, Milo genuinely wondered if the whole county had been right about him from the start. Whatever Milo was chasing, it hadn't turned up yet. Not in the maple, not in the walnut, not in anything he'd cut open all that fall. The low point came when he drove a trailer of what he thought was his best walnut 2 hours to a mill buyer who'd taken material from him before. The buyer walked the stack once, shook his head, and told him plainly it was ordinary lumber-grade wood, worth maybe a third of what Milo had figured on covering that month's fuel and the blade he still owed money on. "Storm damage don't mean special," the buyer told him. "Most of the time it just means damaged." Milo drove home with a mostly full trailer and did the math out loud in the truck the whole way. And for the first time since the derecho hit, he came close to believing everyone in Colter County had him figured right. He didn't quit. He just got a lot more selective about what came home, and a lot quieter about why. The tree that changed things was the one from the Cutter fence line, the very first log Milo had ever hauled, the one Denny had laughed about giving away for free. It had sat near the bottom of the pile for 2 months because it was an awkward shape, a three-way crotch section, thick and heavy, where the old maple had split into separate trunks close to the ground. Crotch wood is a pain to mill, and Milo had put off cutting into it more than once. When he finally got it up onto the resaw in late October, the first pass told him something was different before he'd even shut the saw down. He cut the power, walked around to the far end of the board, and just stood there a moment saying nothing, running his thumb along wood he hadn't fully looked at yet. The whole cross-section shimmered, tight, rippled waves running the length of it, catching the shop light in a way ordinary maple never did. Milo had seen that kind of figure exactly twice before in his life, both times digging through his grandfather's old scrap bin as a boy. And both times Ansel had gone quiet in almost the same way Milo was quiet now. It was called quilted figure, and it didn't come from a tree that had an easy life. It came from stress, decades of a trunk fighting to hold itself upright against open wind, the kind of pressure a fence-line tree takes on that a sheltered, calm-grown tree never does. Straight-grown maple was just lumber. This was what Ansel used to drive the fence rows after every storm looking for, and rarely find. It wasn't just good tonewood. It was the kind of material stringed instrument makers wait years to find, and it was sitting whole and sound at the core, inside a log Denny Cutter had been about ready to burn. Milo took 2 rough-cut sections to a luthier his grandfather used to sell to, a retired man who still kept a phone number and an eye out for material like this. The luthier drove out to Colter County himself 2 days later, turned what was left of the crotch section over a few times in the barn light, and offered Milo more for that single tree than he'd spent hauling logs all fall. But it wasn't really the money that stopped Milo cold. It was where the tree had come from. He asked Denny, almost as an afterthought, how old that fence-line maple had been. Denny didn't know exactly. It had always just been there. But he remembered his own father mentioning that the trees along that line went in sometime in the 60s, a windbreak planted by whoever farmed the ground before the Cutters bought it. Milo already knew who that was. His grandfather had rented that same ground for a few years before buying the Strand place outright, and family talk had always carried one detail Milo had never thought much about. Ansel used to say he'd put in a windbreak he'd never lived to cut. He wanted maple that had taken real wind for 30, 40 years before anybody touched it, wood that wouldn't be ready in his lifetime, and maybe not his son's either. Milo had heard that story as a boy and forgotten it completely. Now he was standing in his own barn, holding a piece of the exact tree his grandfather had put in the ground 60 years before Milo was born, finally broken loose by a storm nobody could have predicted, and landing in the hands of the one person left in the county who still knew what to do with it. Knowing where the tree came from was only half of it. What happened once word got out about that maple was the part nobody in Colter County saw coming. It wasn't lost on him either that people had been just as quick to write off the Strand place itself once. When Milo's father sold the workshop equipment and put everything into row crops, most of the county figured the family had simply given up on something that never made real money to begin with. Old-fashioned work for an old-fashioned man. Done at the end. Milo had spent a fair part of his own farming life hearing some version of that same dismissal. About the land, about the outdated equipment he kept instead of trading up, about ideas people told him flatly wouldn't work. He'd never had a tidy way to argue back. Now he had a barn full of proof that plenty of things written off too early were just waiting on somebody willing to look twice. Word got out slowly the way it does in a small county. Not from Milo, who never talked about it much, but from the luthier, who mentioned to a couple of other buyers where he'd turned up that maple. By winter, Milo had standing requests from 3 different instrument makers and a specialty furniture shop, all wanting first look at anything he pulled figure out of. He wasn't hauling storm debris anymore, not really. He was running, in whatever hours farming left him, a small salvage operation nobody else in the county had the eye to compete with. Buying nothing, taking only what he understood, turning other people's cleanup problem into blanks and boards worth real money to people who knew exactly what figured maple was for. He didn't get rich off it. A load of ordinary storm lumber still sold for ordinary lumber money. And most of what came off his trailer never turned into anything more than construction-grade boards or firewood after all, exactly like the mill buyer had warned him. But the figured sections, the ones he could count on 2 hands most seasons, brought in more per board foot than the rest of the pile combined, enough that by the following fall he'd paid off the mill, replaced the resaw blade twice over, and put a little aside besides. It was slow money, built log by log, season by season, not the kind of thing that made headlines. But it was real, and it was his own. Something had shifted, too, in how people in Colter County looked at the piles behind his barn. Denny Cutter came by that spring the way he sometimes did, and found Milo in the shop running a hand plane over a rough board that still carried a faint shimmer under the sawdust. Denny stood there a minute, looking at the stack of finished lumber leaned against the wall. Nothing fancy, just clean-cut boards, but with that same rippled figure running through every one of them, the kind of wood he'd have burned without a second thought 18 months back. "That from my fence line?" he asked. "Some of it," Milo said. Denny nodded slowly, working something out in his head he didn't quite say out loud. Then, after a while, "You still taking those logs?" Milo set the plane down and looked at the board a second before he answered. "Depends which ones," he said. "Most of what falls in a storm really is just firewood, Denny. I'm not out there thinking every broken tree's hiding something. But you don't find out by burning it first." Denny didn't have much of an answer for that. He just told Milo to call him next time something big came down on his land, and left it there. Nobody in Colter County laughs about the piles behind the Strand barn anymore. If you've got a story about someone who saw value where everyone else saw waste, tell us about it in the comments below. And if you want more stories like this one, stick around, because there's always another log somebody thought wasn't worth a second look.